Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I want to show you how to install Windows Server 2022 on your QNAP NAS. If you are considering moving your existing Windows Server away from Microsoft's own cloud or Azure or something like that, and you want to run it as a bare metal, or you want to run a brand new Windows Server installation from your QNAP NAS as its own host OS, so not running within a VM, this is definitely going to be the video for you. But a few things straight off the bat. Number one, what we're doing today is not really supported by QNAP themselves. So do bear in mind that although what we are doing is completely reversible, you may be using the QNAP outside of its supported range of services there, which can always be something of an issue down the line when it comes to warranty support down the line, or at least software support. So make sure you factor that in. Secondly, everything we're going to do today is installing a fresh Windows Server 2022 installation on this QNAP NAS for us to access as a bare metal server. But you can test out Windows Server 2022 on Microsoft's own website, which I'll direct later on in the video when we do the screen sharing. And secondly, when you do install this as a bare metal, you can synchronize it with your existing cloud backups there, or back up it to the cloud, or migrate that installation over. But what we are doing is using a QNAP NAS locally, and I'm just going to set it up as a first time installation for you. So let's get started. What do we need? Well, we need a QNAP NAS, of course, and you're going to need a QNAP NAS with a moderate amount of power. Now, today we are using the TS464, which arguably is still a little underpowered to really take advantage of all of Windows Server's capabilities. On the most part, it exceeds the minimum requirements, with the exception of one main area to do with memory that we'll talk about later on. But it is running on a quad-core Celeron, and it's got 4 gig of DDR4 memory inside that can be upgraded. There's something you might want to consider down the line. The next thing we're going to need is a boot SSD. Now, this is really, really important, because although the QNAP NAS system has a bunch of hard drive bays inside, and even has a little area of flash where the initial QNAP software, known as QTS, lives inside, when you install Windows Server, you need to install it on a boot SSD. And I strongly do not recommend flashing the SSD that's inside this system that's got your QNAP OS in there. Notwithstanding that it's not really designed for that kind of setup within the architecture, although it is possible. If you do that, you will definitely invalidate any kind of warranty or support and the ability to reverse what you're doing. So what I strongly recommend doing is going for a QNAP NAS system that has dedicated M2 NVMe base, and pick up an affordable SSD, at least 32 gig. Again, I'll show you a few options later on in the video, and this is what we're going to use as our targeted drive to install Windows Server. Also, you're going to need storage drives. Again, which drives you go for is up to you and the size of the NAS you go for. I've got a bunch of drives here. I'm not going to be going through the steps of setting up Windows Server natively within the UI. I'm just going to show you how to install it, and then after that it's up to you. But again, you're going to need separate storage media. If you try to use existing drives from your QNAP NAS array, be that QTS or QUTS, Windows Server will not see those, and you'll need to reformat them. So if you have drives like these that have got QNAP data on them from within the QNAP OS, disconnect them, put them somewhere safe in case you need to bring them back, and reverse all of this. And if you do that, the data on those drives will be visible if you reverse this whole process later. Also, you're going to need a USB. I'll talk about that later on. And again, the type you need, I would go for a small one, but again, later on I'll show you. And you'll also need a keyboard and a mouse, possibly, but you can get away with just a keyboard, as well as an HDMI connected visual output, or using a capture card to be able to interact with this device via HDMI. For my case, I'm using a capture card, but for you, at least briefly, you will need a visual output, so connecting a monitor to that QNAP. So make sure you go with QNAP NAS that has got an HDMI on it, so that's a CPU that's like an Intel, Celeron, Pentium, even a Xeon W. Any kind of QNAP NAS that has integrated graphics will be good for this. But that's everything we need, so we'll move all that off the desk. And now what we're going to do is flick over to my desktop now. And here we are on the desktop of my PC. I'm just going to make sure OBS is definitely recording there. So I'm there at the bottom. I'm just going to wave, make sure it's working. So from here, what do we need to do? Well, I move the mic a little closer. First thing we need to do is download Windows Server. So you can go ahead and try Windows Server. That will take you through to the trial page. From here, enter all of your personal information here for the initialization, to register for the trial, and then after that you'll be given a download link that'll allow you to download Windows Server to this page here. I'll try to link to this page. I'm not entirely certain if you can access it without registering. And what you need to download is the ISO. Now some of you may be shouting that you can go ahead with a VHD, and that's true. You can download the virtual hard drive, but with that you're more inclined to use that if you want to run Windows Server as a contained VM within the QNAP, and thereby adding more layers. Not hugely advised for the sort of setup I'm talking about, but is advised if you want to export your existing cloud-based Windows Server setup and you want to host it as a VM, then I would recommend that option. Plus there's obviously the options over here to test it on Azure if you choose. But what I'd recommend is download that ISO for the fresh installation. Now, I mentioned earlier on about hardware requirements there, and in the most part you should be fine. As you can see by scrolling to the top, you only need half a gig of memory, and you need a 1.4 gigahertz 64-bit processor there. That's something we have here, but it's worth highlighting this issue of ECC memory, because Windows Server strongly recommends that you run using ECC error correcting code or error code correction, and this is when data is being passed through the system. There's an extra element, another module on the memory board there that is creating a little checksum, a little parity check at the beginning and the end of the data transition through the memory, and if there's any inconsistencies, it then does repairs. Therefore, when the write happens, it lowers any potential of bit rot and data inconsistencies long term. So if you're using a NAS that supports ECC memory, Windows Server strongly recommends using it. And although in some cases the system will force you to use ECC memory in your installation, there is a way around it. But I strongly still recommend that you use ECC memory on a NAS if it supports it, if you're going to go for this kind of installation. So once you've downloaded that ISO in the background, make sure you know where you've saved it. The next tool you're going to need is this, Rufus. Now Rufus is an installation tool that allows you to convert an ISO, which is a digital image, into a USB bootable device. So you're going to need to download it. I recommend downloading the portable version. The reason being that the portable version means you never have to install it and it just runs straight from a double click. Another tool you might want to consider later, which will make sense, is Advanced IP Scanner. This is a tool that you use to scan your local area network to find devices. You don't have to use it, but I would still recommend downloading it for later and it will make sense then. When it comes to the NVMe, again, you can go pretty darn small. You can pick up Gen 3 SSDs very, very cheap, and given that very few NAS devices support, and QNAP or others support higher than Gen 3, just go for a nice Gen 3 drive for your installation of Windows Server. You can pick them up pretty darn cheap. I'm using a titanium micro drive, and again, this one 500 gig. This is about 30 quid. So you can pick them up pretty darn cheap. You can get a terabyte very easily. All of these drive at Gen 3 will be perfectly fine. But again, you can use a SATA SSD in one of the main bays. It's all better suited to your QNAP NAS. And finally, the USB I'm using today is this one, the SanDisk Ultra Fit. The reason I use that is the SanDisk Ultra Fit is absolutely tiny. And although the QNAP doesn't have an internal M2 NVMe bay that we're going to be using today, it is still very small and very flush with the system, and that's why I go for these ones. And again, this one's 16 or 32 gig, and you can see the price there. It's $7.99, $7.39. It's really, really cheap, but that's the one I'm going for there. So once you've got all of those applications and services and SSD and USB, we can carry on with our installation. So the first thing we need to do is connect our USB. Get that connected. You'll hear the noise to say that it has been connected, and you should pop up with a drive with absolutely nothing on it, because it will be a completely blank drive. And if I go into this PC settings here, you'll see on there the drive listed here as drive E. We can go into the properties if need be, and we can see there is our empty drive. Now, if the drive has pre-existing partitions, or you want to clean the drive, because remember what we're going to do today is going to completely wipe that drive, what you can do is go to the bottom left of your Windows PC and type in the word disk part. As soon as you see the option for disk part, click disk part. A new window should appear. If you see a black screen there, that's just Windows asking for my permission. And in this window here, type the words list disk. So just two simple words, list disk. It will list the connected drives on this computer that we're using, and you can see disk 2 there is our USB drive there. And then what you can do is select disk 2, then click enter, and now you are focusing in on that USB drive, and then just type the words clean. And what this will do is this will now clean that USB drive. So that USB drive is now cleaned and good to go. When you're done there, you can go ahead and just close disk part, and that drive will be formatted with any partitions. Again, you don't have to do that, but it's just quite useful to use that to get rid of very quickly any existing structural data on the USB for this installation there. But just be careful so you don't accidentally wipe your OS. So now we've done that, the next thing we need to load up is Rufus. Now, whether you've installed it already or not, you can go ahead and just type the word Rufus, just like we did with disk part. And if Rufus is on there, as you can see, there it is, with the P on the end being the portable version. Again, you may see a black screen there. I can go ahead and click OK. I just realised my battery settings are probably quite low, and this may be impacting recording, so I'm just going to bring that up there. Double check OBS is still running. So now we've got Rufus here on screen. We can see that it's noticed our 32 gig no label drive. And the next thing we need to do is go to select. And then from there, go to the directory that we downloaded our ISO. So we can see there is my Windows Server ISO that I've already downloaded in advance. Click open. And then it will scan this ISO to work out some of the configuration settings that we're going to be choosing to use when turning this ISO into our digital USB bootable there. Again, most of these you can completely leave as default, but it's worth looking at here, this little option, because Rufus has an extra little feature that allows it to identify a Windows installation there. I'll download that newer version later. Which means, and you'll see it in a moment when we begin the transfer onto USB, that new options will appear. But leave it as standard Windows installation, and then from there, when you're ready, go ahead and click start. But it won't immediately start. You'll be given an option here on screen. Now this option, again, allows you to tailor that installation. Rufus will check and change some things in the installer. So for example, remember earlier on when I mentioned about the minimum requirements for installation, you can choose to get the installation to ignore those hardware requirements if you choose to. Again, not hugely advised, but if you're running this as a test or as a home lab thing, you know, just playing around, you might want to disable it. Same goes if you want to very quickly create a default user there, which means rather than go through the boring tedium of creating a new user for a new Windows Server installation, you can go ahead and create a new one there. Same goes if you want to make sure things like keyboard stuff and regional stuff is done, as well as disabling those data collection options that it gives you during the installation. You'll still need to walk through the installer for Windows Server, but at the very least this will save you some time. If you've never installed Windows Server before, maybe leave all of these boxes ticked, but otherwise you can leave them all like that. Click OK. And now it's going to convert our Windows Server ISO into our USB bootable. If you're satisfied and happy to blank the disk, click OK. And now it will slowly make that switch over from the ISO into that USB bootable. Now, while it's doing that, that won't take too long. We have to get ready for the next step in our installation. Now it's going to let that run itself in the background. Then the next step in our installation is getting our QNAP ready for that installer. So what I'm going to do now is head over to the other screen now. So now we're back on the other screen. What I'm going to do is move the laptop, move the mic a little bit, because now we have to prepare our QNAP. Again, it will depend on the QNAP you are using. So in my case, I'm using that TS464. For me to install this M2 NVMe, what I need to do is remove all of these bays. And then inside I have got two M2 NVMe bays. In some cases a QNAP will require you to open the case, such as the case of the TS453E, and in some cases it may be on an additional connected card that other SSD bays live. So this part of the installation will differ depending on your own personal setup. So go ahead and grab your SSD. Again, ideally this SSD will have no data on it, but it may have data on it to start with, which I think might be the case with this drive. So I can go ahead, plug that in there. I've connected that drive in. The same goes if I want to upgrade the memory. The upgraded memory slots are in there. I'm not going to attach any hard drives in my installation here, simply because I want to show you guys that you don't need to have any storage in those main bays, and we're going to be targeting that M.2 that we just installed for Windows Server. So now we'll get that case cover back on there. The installation of the USB is at about 90% there, so what we'll do is just get ready for getting the device plugged in. Again, don't turn the mains power on immediately. Make sure you've got the device connected via power. Make sure you've got the device connected with network cable, as you can see there. If the device boots up before you're ready, you can just hold that button down there and it will slowly but surely turn itself off. It should take around about 5 seconds, which is what it's done there. The next thing you're going to need to do is get ready for that keyboard, video, and mouse setup. So grab yourself your USB keyboard and mouse. If your QNAP has USB 2 ports, maybe take advantage of those, but you don't have to use those. We can move that there and get that connected. And again, you don't have to have a keyboard because you can use tab and the arrow keys to navigate the installation, but it's up to you whether you want to go down that road anyway. Finally, what I can do is, for me, I'm going to be connecting my capture card, but for you, you may well be utilizing a direct HDMI monitor, but make sure you've got all of those connected before we begin our installation there. So I'm going to flick back over to this screen. The installation still has yet to complete, so I'm just going to fast forward. Okay, so now the installation has completed, as we can see there. So the next thing we need to do is safely disconnect our USB. Very, very pivotal. So what we do is we go down to the bottom right menu here, right click, and safely eject our USB. A notification will sound on screen to let us know that that has happened. And now we can disconnect our USB drive. Now, the next few steps, I'm going to have to flick around on our screens the tiniest bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is move over to my capture box here at the top. So actually we'll move that down there to keep me there on screen and maximize that screen resolution the tiniest bit. Will make sense later. So while we've got that black screen there for you to see, the next thing we need to do is take our USB drive. Pop that there. We take our USB and we're going to connect it to an available USB port on the QNAP. Once that's connected, we have to make sure, one, we've got our keyboard and or definitely keyboard, but maybe a mouse connected, and be ready with that, and make sure that the QNAP is connected to the same network as the machine that you are going to be interfacing with, be it whether it is that you're going to be KVMing in with a keyboard, video, and a mouse directly, or you're going to be utilizing another machine like me and a network, a streaming box like I'm using. So what we need to do is get ready on the delete, F12 and F2 keys. Now, I could tell you that you just need to spam the delete key in a moment, and that's probably true. But because different QNAPs use different motherboards, and indeed other NASs use different motherboards, sometimes the BIOS key that you're going to need to use in the next step will change. So for the next bit, I recommend spamming the F2, F12, and delete key. I'm just going to get that set up here for me. And what we do now is turn on our QNAP NAS, and now we just start spamming those three keys. Double check that our QNAP NAS is booting. Go for it there. And we'll know that it's working because on screen you will see a change of what's being visibly accessible, because what you see there will change. So I'm just going to keep spamming these buttons until eventually we hear a brief beep from the QNAP NAS there, whereupon at the moment is loading video drivers there into the motherboard, and after that beep we should see something appear here on screen to signify that the motherboard has started going into its boot sequence, and we can access the visual interface of our QNAP NAS. There we go, there's our first prompt there. So it's just loading in. We're going to keep pressing those keys to stop the system booting beyond what we're doing. And it should take us into the blue screen BIOS any second now. There we are. We're in our blue screen BIOS. So from here, and now I'm going to minimize the size of me here at the bottom. We've got to go through a few different options. Now again, navigating with the keyboard, we want to make our way over to the boot option here, and as you can see, the range of drives is changed, because normally when you boot up a QNAP, the first thing the system does is access that internal SSD that I mentioned, and what we need is for the first thing this system to do is read the USB. We need it to read that USB so it can start the installation, but it's also recommended that you change the second option to that SSD that we've just installed. The reason being that after we've finished our installation, we're going to disconnect the USB, and we want to make sure that the system, the next thing it does is boot from the NVMe that we've installed, in my case, that M2 NVMe. Now, there you go, that's the whole setup, and again, I will touch on this later on, but if you need to reverse this process and go back to the QNAP installation, repeat the steps that we've done so far, tapping those keys to get into BIOS, and then just rechange the order of the drives to change the priority back to the QNAP SSD first time. But for now, this is the sort of screen you want to see on your QNAP. Then tap right, and then click Save Changes and Exit. And when you click Save Configuration, what it will do now is immediately read from that USB that we've connected first time. So it's going to reboot the system, but rather than previously where it would have booted from the QNAP NAS SSD, now it's going to boot from the M2, the USB that we connected. And as you can see now we can go ahead with our usual installation. So for me, I'm going to change this keyboard entry into United Kingdom, and because I can't see myself on screen, I'm going to move my little icon here to the top right, and from here we can go ahead and just click using the tab key to navigate to where it says next. If you've got the mouse enabled, it will be a lot quicker for you. So go ahead and click install. Remember, this USB also acts as a Windows repair disk as well for later on if you need it. So you can go ahead and start the installation, and from here the steps to navigate you through the Windows Server installation are largely the same to what you might expect. So what it will do is ask you which version of Windows Server we want to install. So in my case, I'm going to go with the standard evaluation, but of course there is Data Center Edition depending on the scale of your system. After that, it will ask you to confirm the terms and conditions. You can go ahead and click that, and now you choose whether you want to upgrade an existing installation or go with a brand new one there. So for me, I'm going to install the operating system, but again, we can choose whichever one we want. Next up, we've got to select the drive that's going to be used for this installation. So in my case, there is that 500 gig drive I've got inside, but it's worth highlighting in my case, I need to format this drive. So if you do need to format the drive, use tab and highlight the format tab or delete tab to empty the content of that drive and its partitions, which is what I'm doing now in order to make this drive ready and accessible for our installation there. So now I've selected that drive, we're going ahead and starting with the installation, and now it's going to start installing Windows Server just like it would on any bare metal server, but this time it's doing it on a QNAP NAS there. Now, the amount of time this will take depends wildly on the power of your system and the speed of the M2 SSD or SATA SSD that you're choosing to install the OS on. You can install the OS on a standard hard drive, but I wouldn't recommend it, because then Windows Server will be throttled and bottlenecked by the performance of a SATA mechanical hard drive, which regardless of the scale of the storage that you're going to be managing in Windows Server, will form as a bottleneck. But there you go, the rest of this installation is fairly straightforward. And if you've ever installed Windows on a new PC, or even installed Windows Server 2022 or 2019 or 16 or 12 or whatever prior to this, it's all pretty much the same. And then afterwards you can use the tool Advanced IP Scanner to find your server on the local area environment, or continue to use your KVM setup to interface with the device directly. If you want to know more about guides on setting up your RAID configuration from within the Windows Server software and the GUI, utilizing their own storage manager tools and disk manager tools, I recommend going over to Microsoft's own guides where they'll guide you through all of that. But this has been how to install Windows Server 2022 on a QNAP NAS. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.